Awesome. So, yeah, thank you so much for making time in your day. And I know you've been really busy studying and gardening and in the middle of all of the really intense things that have been happening this weekend. I'm glad that you make time for us to just very informally and get real about COVID-19, the pandemic, to hear perspectives from the medical institution side and everything. So thank you so much. If we could start just you like introducing yourself in whatever way you want, and what's your relationship to medicine.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much. I'm a medical student, and my relationship to medicine is one of still working towards my MD. And I'm based on the East Coast in the U.S.
Awesome. And why did you want to study medicine, or what's your area of interest?
Okay, yeah. So I think I'm just one of those people who just kind of always wanted to be a doctor, which I know like isn't a great answer, but it's an answer that I like come to accept about myself. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think that I just like have like a really like a high regard for like the human body and like the human mind, and like I really think it's like been like not to be like too like cliche, but like I really view it as like a calling to like heal. And I think that the way that my life has allowed me to like succeed has been through like school and like science, and I think it just like made sense to like help use science to like help like heal other people. I also appreciate that it allows me to just like have a sanctity of life. So I just like hold the value of like a single life a very high, which we could talk about within the context of conflict or this
Hmm.
pandemic and like kind of who it affects. But I just think it allows me to like exert my compassion in like a very immediate way that's also like backed by science. And
Yeah.
in LGBTQ health, I've done a lot of LGBTQ health education. I've done work with neglected tropical diseases in Central America. And I'm interested in neurology, particularly like pesticides exposure with migrant workers. I did some like learning from some indigenous folks as well as migrant workers who worked at certain plantations in Central America, and talking to folks about like early Parkinson's symptoms. But I really like talking about kind of the things in medicine that aren't being talked about and sort of filling those holes. I found that I like being like, this is a gaping hole in medicine. Let's talk about it. Which
Yeah.
isn't that appreciated by the establishment, but I think it's important.
Yeah, that's something that when I began like following your work, I saw that you really were passionate about, but also like disappointed in how much ground still needs to be covered in the medical institution and in the medical profession to just even approach like LGBT health.
Sorry, was that a question?
No, it's just like it's just a comment. It's just like
Yeah, yeah.
I think we usually, at least the US usually positions itself as like being at the vanguard of like education and at the forefront of just like research and everything. But when it comes to like very obvious things for like queer people of like depression or just how to approach or like etiquette, like you notice how much of the institution has like failed these populations.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like a total disaster, especially given like I go to what is considered like a very elite institution. I go to an institution that defines itself as like a leader in healthcare globally. And yet our psychiatric education was from videos from the DSM-4 that looked like they were done in like the early 2000s. And then we like received a single handout about like how like threatening patients can be and how we need to like follow our instinct and like our gut when we think someone is going to be aggressive. And I'm like, wow, I can see how in no way, shape, or form this lends itself to the continued incarceration of like Black and Indigenous people of color, you know, like autistic children, like being treated differentially based on like how aggressive they're perceived. So yeah, I think that there's just, it's just like mind boggling how inadequate our education is, like, frankly, like, I feel like most of the work that I do in learning how to like truly heal comes from outside of the establishment. And like I'm really happy I know how the kidneys work and like I love cells in the stomach, but like honestly, those are things that I could like self teach. And like I'm unsure why there's such a fixation on like these like basic molecular principles when like they do guide clinical care, but it leaves so much damage in its wake. And it's Sorry, I live on like a very major major street near some hospitals, so there's gonna be some noise. But yeah, pretty mind-boggling how inadequately we're trained, frankly.
Yeah, and hopefully towards the end of our conversation, we can talk about mutual aid and what does like building infrastructure, medical infrastructures outside of the medical industrial complex like looks like.
Mhm.
But first, let's go into like the main point of our conversation, which is, of course, COVID-19, the pandemic. And I just want to start with like, how do you think like the response, and we could divide this up into a state response, particular hospital response, or individual response. But how has this response been, particularly focused on the U.S.?
Right. I mean, I think the response has been abysmal, and it's from like an overall level. I think I'm trying to think of like the different components of it. So when you think about coronavirus, you know, you think about the disease itself. So what did we know about the disease? And I think that like, you know, I think the US is good at being like, this is the molecular etiology. Like we studied this in a lab, and like they had kind of like all these like little minutia tips that actually, let me reframe this. I feel like it comes kind of both from like the citizens or like residents of this state, and then also from like, you know, the actors like at like the government level, like, you know, like the president or like the CDC, et cetera. And then like kind of like the healthcare workers. And it's odd to me that so there's such a fixation on finding a cure, there's such a fixation on finding a vaccine, that like all of these resources are being sent to look at these molecular etiologies. All these NIH, you know, grants are being sent to these labs to like find like the cure, and like, you know, enhancing like the free market competition to like find out like the best solution that like is going to come at the low cost. And like even my mom, who is like you know, definitely like does not like adhere to like a lot of these like kind of like overarching like state principles, and like says a lot of things like, when I was in Central America I was a lot more free than I was in the US. But even she's like, oh, aren't the doctors going to get us a vaccine, aren't they going to get us a vaccine? And I feel like there's such an emphasis on biomedicine saving us, that we are just like at a completely like, we are unable as a country to understand solutions outside of a biomedical praxis, and like that is why so many people died. And I think that the steps that needed to be taken, and I mean, I've said this multiple times, but like the US just needs to learn how to read the room. And like I feel like we saw so many countries responding to this quickly. We saw really great responses coming out of South Korea, China, Japan, in which they instituted, you know, quarantine. And we could definitely talk about like kind of the totalitarian state control of that process, but really just from like a public health level, they had folks quarantine, they had folks social distance. In South Korea, they actually like have programs where like folks are like given food to their doorstep, they're given masks, they're given gloves on like literally a weekly basis, or they go into CVS based on like what month they were born, and then like they get those supplies. I'm sure it wasn't CVS, but like, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
a
Yeah.
like a drugstore or something, and like they get the supplies that they need based on like a very like organized method. And like I think there's something to be said about how we search for our solutions in biomedicine almost exclusively, and it's burning through all of our healthcare spending money. And it's I think the issue around masks, because especially concerning, because I think it's a good example of how do I say this? How fixated the US is on being the gold standard, and like they're so hesitant to take advice unless they've proven it in their labs on their terms. And it resulted in like definitively like tens of thousands of deaths, because like we weren't able to get on the wavelength of the rest of the world, which is like wearing masks way ahead of us. Like the Chinese CDC said like a month before the US CDC said that we should wear masks, that like the single biggest mistake that European and like American countries are making is not wearing masks. I have like all of these quotes. Like the former director of the FDA in the US was like, why are we not saying people need to be wearing masks? So the whole thing, I think, was so delayed. And then it was so disconcerting to see how, like, I personally, like, during this pandemic was like working on a resource on like how to make masks. So how to make cloth masks, how to do it safely, like what materials you should and shouldn't use, like kind of the basic principles behind that, which we can definitely talk about. But it was so disconcerting to see, like, I was like talking to people and they were looking at me like I'm crazy. They're like, Casey, I've literally had this said to me like so many times. very smart people working on this pandemic, and don't worry about it. And like I feel like that kind of like cult of expertise and that like cult of like, oh, someone else is going to deal with it, the doctors are going to save us, like those things are like are artificial like methods of like state control. And like we as individual actors like need to question how we are trying to optimize like our safety and the safety of others. And like we can't like sit back and like wait for like these like government mandates or suggestions. And so it was so disconcerting about the CDC response about masks is like finally in the beginning of April, it wasn't even a month ago, they were like, okay, we recommend mask use. And then all of a sudden you see all of these states being like, okay, like if you don't wear a mask, you're going to get a $1,000 fine. And then if folks did wear masks, specifically people of color, specifically Black men of color, if they were like entering a space wearing a mask, like they would get punished by like the same carceral state that would have punished them for not wearing a mask. And I think that's so disconcerting. And like this entire issue could have been like this entire thing could have been remedied by listening to other world leaders, looking at the basic science coming out of other countries and making common sense conclusions for like public safety. Like I truly don't understand. Like I feel that this kind of like cult of expertise has like rusted away our common sense. And like everyone coming into this pandemic like at a gut level knew we needed to wear masks, and that's why there was such like a response like, don't wear masks, you don't know what you're talking about. And everyone's like, oh gee, I guess like, yeah, I'm not a scientist, I don't really know, like okay, I guess I won't wear a mask. But like everyone on like a very gut level knew that was necessary and like would have been happily wearing masks since the get-go.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting to see how like countries that have like responded effectively, it was a combination of people respecting these individual practices of like wearing a mask and social distance, but they were also complemented with structural government institutions that adequately distributed resources and medical supplies and testing kits and food for the people that need it. But in the US, we didn't really get a strong institutional network. And people, even I think you say like the cult of expertise. On one side, we have the cult of expertise, but on the other side, we have this entire population that doesn't even believe that this is a real thing that's happening. I don't know if you've seen Plandemic, the right wing documentary about.
I didn't see the documentary, but I saw like content about it.
Yeah, so it's like I think we learned so much about specific governments and cultures and how they've like responded to this life-threatening situation, and how the US has like completely like stumbled and continued to make mistakes. And I completely agree with now the speech is now about the vaccine, and vaccines takes months and months of research and trials to get approved. But I even noticed this with like Trump, like a month ago, where now the talk is less about structural change or structural networks of support to people that need it the most. The speech is now, we're working on the vaccine, and as soon as the vaccine is done, everything will go back to normal.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And I do want to say that what's interesting is I agree. Like I think that all of like so much of this could have been prevented by just like common sense methods of protection and state infrastructure. Well, I hesitate to say state infrastructure specifically, but like allowing people to like get resources that they need in order to survive in like an organized fashion by individuals who claim to be our leaders. Like that didn't ever come to fruition. And like all we were able to do is fine people for not following the rules, as if like there was no effort to educate anyone. There was no effort to educate anyone at any point during this crisis. And if you're like a housing insecure person, if you're a housing insecure person of color, like you just, like acclimate to the situations that like are given to you, and like one day you might find yourself getting fined for something that was fine a week ago, which is like really scary. Yeah. How that operates. I also want to say that although other countries did a really effective job in responding, that there was like an aspect of state control that was like really disconcerting. And I actually noticed even in like a lot of like radical groups, mostly folks that are based in the US, I think that we definitely have like a little bit different of a positionality seeing how things manifest like outside of US context, especially within like, you know, organizations of people that want to be autonomous, within like an indigenous global context of like autonomy and like, you know, a locus of control and stuff like that. And it was interesting to see people calling for the National Guard to establish hospitals and like calling to dispatch these like ships. And I'm like, yo, like we do not want to be on a ship. Like you don't want to be on that ship. Like you don't want to be like held in place by like the National Guard. Like those are methods of control, to control spread, to control the individual. They're not like these like floating hospitals on the sea that are gonna like fix our problems. And I feel like in other countries, like although like in China, like the, you know, mandated quarantine measures were very effective, I also think we need to balance that with like the lack of like rights, frankly, and like the lack of agency and like the lack of mobility that like people in China were experiencing at that time. And I think like the only way out of this is like personal like accountability for like the collective good. And like if like that is literally the only way out of this pandemic, without like, and it's interesting because I feel like both sides don't want a totalitarian state, but like the right is just like is like fixated on this idea that like this is a totalitarian state, and it's difficult for me to understand how they could think that while they're allowed to go outside and protest. Like their very protest is evidence
Yeah.
like against the state they say is like taking place.
I do think that it's the when
Well,
talking about the state, I think a lot of like organizers and movements has have known that in moments of crisis, the state takes it as an opportunity to increase their power, militarize cities, and suspend liberties.
totally.
But at the same time, you can have like very effective states that do it in a particular way, but other states that do it really wrong, and like it could tend to be like very scary. Like I would want to know more about people experiencing this from like El Salvador or like places in like the global south or Nicaragua, which is something that we should people should be thinking in the horizon of all of our conversation. But I want to talk a little bit about what do you think, what role did like hospitals or like private hospitals played in all of this? Like again, the US has completely positioned itself as having the best medical institutions in the world, but at the same time, they were only as strong as the state was, or they're only as strong as the city or the mayor of the city was, or they're only as strong as their network with community health centers or other hospitals. But I want to know if there's been a lot of discontent inside of like doctors, or like has it still all been pretty neoliberal where they want to privatize the vaccine and stuff?
Right. Sorry, there's a bug on me. Yeah. I'll respond to the first part of your question because I'm not too sure about like the privatization of like vaccines and stuff, but I do know that there's like a disturbing amount of like free market competition happening that like is just wasting money. But yeah, in the hospitals, like it's like there is a lot of tension in the hospitals. And it's difficult after coming out of this. It really feels like hospital administrators, like you know, with great liberty take away physician rights. Early on in this pandemic, I received an email from my hospital reminding me that every single correspondence I received via this email, everything is confidential, which feels a lot like a gag order, frankly. Especially given that during my rotation at this hospital, I had asked for a master in coronavirus, and I had been denied one multiple times. And then when I did triage for folks, again, I continued to ask for adequate protection, and I was denied. And then I decided to stop doing triage because I had this like kind of fundamental awakening where I was like, oh, they don't care, like fully don't care. And I think that like that realization was like a wake up call for me. And so like I kind of stepped away from the hospital setting, but like even and so like now I've been doing a lot of like activism and like health education, et cetera, but I haven't been in the hospital for a while. But we are going to return in July. That being said, specifically, I think you could really see the tensions between like hospital administrators and physicians within the context of New York, specifically like the predominantly Black areas in which Black physicians were kind of like flagged as like the expert on that population, the expert on COVID, because like they like treated them so often. And so then like the older physicians would be like, okay, younger physicians of color, like this is your community, like you know about this, like get out there. And it would be like these like residents, and like these young residents of color are just like they're passing away. I know someone who got COVID 4 times, who straight up tested back of the throat, nasal swab, tested for COVID 4 times. And they have to keep going into work. And like, I think that there's such intense social control. And like, I'm someone who identifies as an anarchist. I'm someone who like does really value dissent and like does not give like authority, respect for like authority's sake. When I was in the hospital, like as a medical student, my mom was like, hey, like, are you going to leave? Like, why are you still in the hospital? And I was like, oh, I guess I'm just going to get sick. Like, they're like, I like very literally, like, there is no other option. And like, I think growing up, I was like fairly naive about like how much dissent you could like kind of lean into like as like a professional. And like, I mean, doctors' lives have been like ruined for speaking up. You've been fired. And as a medical student, like I've experienced a lot of repercussions for speaking up from like many different sorts of people. So it's difficult. And something really wild that was happening too is in the beginning of the pandemic, the doctors weren't even allowed to bring in their own N95 leading like hospital protocol. And so they were just like, in order to like maintain their protocol, using like inadequate supplies and like risking physicians' lives so that their protocol could catch up. And like, I just feel like so much of this is like symptomatic of like the like failed nation state and like bureaucracy, which is like unable to adapt to situations of crisis, because like our entire healthcare system is like revolved around like putting band-aids on things, putting very, very, very expensive band-aids on things. Like we're more content to like spend money on like a very expensive like treatment for individuals who have like already experienced like the end consequence of like diabetes or like kidney disease, and like we're not interested in investing money on like safe school lunches so that the people like don't develop diabetes in the first place. And at the end of the day, like our state is a capitalist state, and the most important thing is like making a profit margin. So like if these are able to make vaccines, they're going to make a profit margin. If these, startups are going to be able to sell to hospitals, that's a profit margin. If the sorry, I was a little rambly there.
No, that makes sense. Something that really struck me was this whole deal with the respirators and how pharmaceutical companies really wanted to be on top of it. But like a group of like 3D printers were like, here's something that will like either help respirators or like increase the quality, or like to try to decentralize pharmaceutical companies from all the decision making. But those like were eventually like suppressed or sued, or like hospitals weren't even going to like accept all this like free stuff that the people were kind of creating. But as you said, like you definitely see where hospitals incentives are, and specifically now because a lot of people aren't getting those high expensive operations, like hospitals are like, I don't want to say facing bankruptcy, but they're like their entire operations have shifted because it was built on top of like exploiting people and getting all their money. But the question I had for you is like, how do you feel around all this narrative about essential workers but called heroes, or like nurses and doctors? I mean, you just see people spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on billboards, on flying aircrafts, to just like normalize this speech around heroism and like how brave frontline workers are. And like, I don't know if that's something you've talked with your peers, or that you've like processed.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to like hospitals losing money during this time, and I guess I just want to say that the way that like the U.S. like established its hospital system was based on like a bunch of specialists, like doctors, frankly, like around a table being like, this is how much each thing costs, and like this is how hard each procedure is, and it just like completely devalued primary care. Like the reason that we're losing money from a pandemic in which people are utilizing the healthcare system more is because like we created like an artificial system of like of payment and like incentives. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the hero narrative, I think it's like very much like a double-edged sword. So on one hand, I think from a disability standpoint, I think that the hero narrative allows doctors to monopolize resources and fundamentally value their lives over the lives of disabled people. And I've been working with a lot of physicians on like securing PPE for physicians, but I, am someone who I'm trying to contextualize the risk of like getting adverse or like there's a lot of talk on like how physicians need more resources because like they're performing risky procedures, right? And so like if they're performing these risky procedures, they're exposed to more coronavirus and they're going to have a worse disease, right? Like that's kind of like the logical sequelae there. From a disability justice standpoint, like perhaps like the disabled person or like someone with like an immune compromised like condition, like they don't need to get as much virus in their system in order to like get a really severe consequence. And so like those two groups, like people with immune compromised conditions and physicians, like are experiencing similar risk, but because one of them is a hero and one of them is like a patient and like a drain on resources, one of them gets relegated to like receiving like the highest standard of protection, and the other one is like, okay, well, I guess like we're gonna put you on like the bottom of the list for a triage model for who gets ventilators because you have like like less value to our society because of like how much you could contribute under capitalism. So I think that like there's that aspect of like a hero which like relegates resources to like white, like upper middle class, like well-educated elite, and like leaves other non-hero like drain on resources, like people to like just frankly die. And like I think it's like a way to like, I think it's like an artifact of white supremacy. I think it's like an artifact of a lot of things. That being said, like that's kind of like one layer. I think it's like it's like an extraction of resources from folks who would otherwise really need them. On the other hand, I think that when you're looking at like more of the physicians that are really not being given PPE, they're given, garbage bags, they're being viewed as like the expert on COVID just because they look like their patients. By calling those individuals heroes, you're just like validating their slaughter, essentially. And like, I think that there's something so dehumanizing in relegating someone superhuman. Like, I think there are two ways to dehumanize someone. There's like not considering them a human and being like, you are like you are not equal to me fundamentally, and then there's like idealizing someone and speaking for them. And I think that by relegating doctors as heroes, like government workers are able to like speak over healthcare workers, like and it's interesting because like if you think about it, like by calling doctors heroes, government workers are able to both like justify their deaths and then like kind of like peacefully continue on their lives where they get testing, they get PPE, and like no one's really and they like advertise it because they're just so fixated on like how much of a hero the physician is. It like displaces like perhaps like a critical public eye on like the government consumption of resources, because even like the ventilator thing, like the government is like sequestering them. Like,
and this is only attention if there's like scarcity, if there's like not enough resources, and that says to like how unprepared the state was and how unable it has been to like cooperate with other countries. And then the part of the heroes, I mean, again, you can see this in Trump's speech and how he calls the pandemic the invisible enemy, and it's already approaching this from what's called a like war ontology. Like you call people heroes so that you can legitimize their death, and so that you can, and you're just turning doctors, nurses, and like all these people into soldiers for a unexistent war that could have been preventable. And it takes accountability away from the government. But then you just see this as a war. You're just going to make war-like decisions to face this, and that's not what the U.S. needs right now. The other, let's keep going. I think we've touched upon how the state will definitely not save us, and we've kind of hinted towards other ways to organize or distribute, or like to take advantage of the crisis to critique the state, but also to like build our own networks. But before we get to that, um what are, in your opinion, some things that will like never go back to normal, or like what have we been able to unmask and uncover from the state that people will like no longer accept? That's one side, and the other side is like just socially, like, are we going to go back to the club? Are we going back to festivals? Are we going to continue life as we're going, or will we always live in fear of the pandemic returning?
Right. I think we'll go back to clubs. I think we could go take our vacations. I just think it'll take probably 1 or 2 years to fully feel completely safe. I think this summer, I live on the East Coast, so it's really nice here right now. I think if people behave responsibly, I think if people don't gather in large groups, really only hang out with a very select group of people, definitely less than 10 people, preferably less than 5 people, just like in your kind of social orbit. I think we'll make it out. I really do. And I think that the concern is when it comes fall. I think that most likely this summer the fresh air is going to be really great. People's houses are going to be cleared out. Like, I just think that the warm weather is just going to literally allow like the virus like more space to dissipate, as opposed to like being inside and like being constantly exposed to like the same like air, like,
Mhm.
not like the a lot of the danger of coronavirus during the winter when like we couldn't like open like our windows like when it was like snowing out. So I think the summer is going to help a lot. But I am concerned about the fall because you're going to get colds, you're going to get the flu, and you're going to get more coronavirus. And I think that by the fall, people are going to feel more relaxed, but that's actually when we need to put up our defenses even more. I will say that there is some good news, and I feel like there's like never really good news for coronavirus. I'm going to put it out. But the CDC recently found that coronavirus doesn't spread via surfaces as much as we thought it did. So that does not mean that you should stop washing your hands. That doesn't mean you should stop cleaning off your counters. Like, everything that you've been doing up until now has allowed you to survive up until now. And like, it is a-okay to continue cleaning as much as your income allows you to, and like, continue getting out resources to folks who need it, cleaning supplies and stuff like that. um but I think it just underscores the importance of wearing masks. And I think it's so interesting that we were so invested. Like, again, there's like this kind of, like you were talking about, like the 3D printers who like wanted to make ventilators. I also think that there's kind of like a negative to that, which is like our fixation on entrepreneurship and like our fixation
Yeah.
on, like, I literally had to write this entire mask making guide by myself because like no one at my institution wanted to help me because it wasn't sexy, it wasn't new, like it wasn't like a new ventilator, it wasn't a 3D printing model, like it was literally just me being like, okay, like we need 1 or 2 layers of cotton, like what's going on here, like let me look at some material science. And like, I think that there's something to be said about the fact that the US tried this approach to like sanitize everything, like kind of like it's a war, like you need to like eliminate the threat, you need to get the threat out of your house, as opposed to being like you need to protect yourself and others, and like you need to be like cognizant and like aware of like how you interact with other people. um so yeah, I don't, yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your
No, yeah,
question.
yeah, you definitely did. And I'll take just on the last note you said, it has a lot to do with how do you interact with other people. And I know we've had this conversation before, but I would just want to give you the space to maybe point out your what you might think are some of your unpopular opinions, or like some particular rants you have. I know I live. I've seen a lot of people outside. I think a lot of people. It's nice out, and people are kind of doing the absolute minimum because the threat is not personal to them, or they haven't feel touched by
Yeah.
this. And my question is like, where do you draw the line? Like, we've already reached 100,000 deaths, like cases, and like, where do we draw the line until we take things seriously and get uncomfortable for a while?
Yeah, and I feel like that reluctance to feel discomfort is something that comes from a place of first world privilege, that like kind of like discomfort is unnatural. Discomfort is something that I could buy away. Discomfort is something that I could run away from. And like my most unpopular opinion for like the well-educated kind of like college elite crowd that like was responding to this is they were like running is good for my mental health. And I'm like, look, you can find a different way to deal with your mental health. And let's be real, like a lot of this fixation on running comes from fat phobia. It comes from like ableism. Like it comes from wanting to like keep up your like body during this time. And like, yes, like running is great for your cardiovascular health. It's great for your respiratory health. It's great for fending off prediabetes. It's really, obviously exercise is something that physicians talk about over and over and over again. Like we love it. We love to see people running, but right now is not the time. It's okay to gain a few pounds. It's okay to not be at like your optimal heart rate. It's okay to like sit with your discomfort and like, practice mindfulness and like practice other strategies. And I think that you see it in like predominantly like light skinned, like educated college students who are not experiencing the same trauma as like like inner city people of color who are literally seeing their communities be decimated by this. And it's so easy to just like take a run on like like a popular like esplanade by like a river and just like dissociate from the larger context because like you feel a little better and like wow, that was so good for me. And like initially everyone's like, oh god, like I finally made it inside today, I felt so good. And like I guess I want to balance like if like I have an outside space that I could spend time in, so like
Yeah.
I spend as much time here as I can. And like I am being like very cognitive. I like honestly didn't go to the park right above my house for like a month. And like I don't say this to try to be like I'm like this like sinless person who like behaved in like totally the perfect way. But like I say this to mean like if you are someone with the privilege of an outside space, you need to be accessing that space predominantly.
Mhm.
And like we need to allow folks who do not have access to other spaces to have access to public parks. And like we really need to view this as like optimizing everyone's access to like blue spectrum lighting and like natural like grassy like spaces with like trees and like various foliage. Like those things are essential for mental health. And like your like run 7 times a week like is not, especially given that the runners aren't wearing masks and they're like, oh, like I can't breathe when I run and I can't wear a mask. And I'm like, you are literally potentially spreading pathogens to so many people. And like it's so important to realize that like if you are like a light skinned, if you are like a white person taking a run, like you might be, and like you might be killing people of color. And like I think that that's something that like people don't want to accept. People really like estranging themselves from the consequences of their actions, especially in this like really individualistic capitalist society. But like I think that something that will never come back to normal in like a good way is that like now we intimately know that like all of our health is like intertwined. Like we are like together like a breathing earth, and like one person's actions will affect another person. And like I think that there's such an overemphasis on not making people feel bad and like ensuring everyone feels like their mental health is like taken care of. And like yes, mental health's important, like yes, physical health's important, but it's really important to like defend the most vulnerable people in our society. And like right now like the interests and like recreational activities of like college educated elite is like being held up as more important than like staying and like protecting folks who don't have those same privileges. So yeah, whenever I say people shouldn't go on runs, like people like blow up my inbox and they're like, I'm literally my mental health depends on it. And I was like, okay, well the lives of like other people depend on you not doing this. Like I just like I want like that is, and it's like I think that people are so used to like kind of being like coddled in this country where it's like, and I don't want to sound like one of those like right wing people who it's like all these snowflakes, because that's not the case. But like
Mhm.
I feel like the over validation we extend one another when we do like kind of like crappy things like it had to end during this pandemic. And I had to say like, okay, I know your mental health like is affected by this, but you are going to disproportionately hurt people of color. And like as a light-skinned white person, like you have to know that like there's no way around it. I'm not going to not tell you to make you feel better. Like your actions are harming other people. And like I think like that frankness by which we have to talk to one another is like the thing that's going to help us survive. Like we just like I think that we have to advocate for people that like aren't in this space because those are the people that are going to be like experiencing like the brunt of this crisis.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No,
space,
that makes.
like the people that are still going on runs and stop going on runs.
I've never thought about it like that. I think you mentioned it like really, really well, that people don't have this like collective mentality or collective accountability,
Yeah.
or have found ways to justify their everyday individual actions in an individual level to whatever makes them, but they don't think of like this collective health or collective good, or how, or the politics of public space, or the racial politics of public space. And it does say a lot about how, what kind of people are outside and what kind of people feel entitled to certain activities, exercises, and stuff. I mean, I've seen the ridiculous protesters in front of the gym trying to see like, open the gym up, this is fake, we need to go work out inside of the gym, and like stuff like that. Or then it's also tied to all the people that want a haircut and want their personal aesthetic or personal mental health to be addressed through them looking good and feeling good. But I think it's,
Yeah, like mental health addressed through like extorting others. And like I feel like, right, that's what our society is founded on. It's founded on us wearing fashion forward clothes that extorted labor from others. And I think we have to like critically examine like how much of our pleasure comes from the like extortion of others. And like I think that's something that's been put into like high focus.
yeah.
Yeah.
Now kind of our last two sections now, I think we've been already touched upon of this, but like what are, we've noticed with just evidence and studies how people of color and queer people of color have been are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and this is tied to like historical racism, urbanism, space, the medical institutions, and all of this. But what, in your opinion, like what are something out of this white supremacist like capitalist network, what's something that you want to highlight that that reflects why people of color are disproportionately affected by COVID?
Right. And I think it comes down to pre-existing conditions.
Yeah.
And then, yeah. And I think that I attended a really great talk by, I believe it was like the Black Cardiologist Association of like North America, something along those lines. But yeah, it was a bunch of cardiologists of color talking about specifically like the health of Black folks during this time, and how conditions such as hypertension, conditions such as, you know, high cholesterol, conditions such as diabetes, conditions such as asthma, are all leading to increased death rates. And I think a good example is, you know, you'll look at like, you know, everyone's like, there's kind of like this like stereotypical like, you know, individual with pre-existing conditions, like someone who's at risk for COVID, like they're like an, you know, an elderly like white person who has you know, pre-existing conditions. And you know, they're like the grandmas that like are, you know, our country wants to sacrifice for the economy, etc. But we
Mm-hmm.
also have to realize that like if like a Black child was exposed to levels of pollution their entire lives, if they live in like these pollution belts like by highways, their risk is synonymous to the risk of someone who's 50 years older than them. And like by being a person of color in the United States, like you are aging and you are experiencing risk that's like wildly disproportionate to like your other age match peers with like different racial demographics. And so when like you know, like a 20-year-old walks in with COVID and, you know, like has a history of asthma, like has pre-diabetes, like hasn't had access to like antihypertensive medications, that person is gonna have an overwhelmingly larger risk of dying of COVID. But what's so like not like interesting, but really it's almost like, maybe it is, maybe, yeah, it's something that was a little disturbing to me. But I think that there, like our country has been so fixated on like the biological differences between races, and that even, you know, that extends into white people being like, oh, I could see who's affected by this and I'm not concerned. And like white people genuinely don't understand that like if they have the same pre-existing conditions because like they live in like a rural area where they're not able to get healthcare and like don't have healthy food, like they're at similar risk. But because like we code everything within like, especially within like the right wing, within this like racial lens, and like, oh, white people like aren't in as much danger, like it causes white people to like actually put their own lives at risk. And like it's like kind of like, it's like very scary to see. And I know that like a lot of these people's actions are fueled by racism, but I also think like the same risks that like apply to people of color within cities like do apply to like other white populations. And I think that folks who live in cities like tend to have like like tend to have like the like vernacular or like language to be like, okay, like I have asthma, like I have hypertension, and are able to sort of like navigate the health system just because of like the density and like the education level that like it tends to be in these areas. But it's so odd to see these like white people like roll up to these like anti-COVID marches and be like, we just got to open the hospitals up, you know, we got to open it up, like I have heart failure, like we got to open it up. And I'm like, sweaty, like you got to go home, like what? And there's all these white people that are like, I have lupus, or like, you know, I have like XYZ condition, and like COVID is making it so I can't see my doctor, and they're like out protesting without a mask. And like there's something so scary about this like place and end stage capitalism that we're in, because like I really don't believe we've ever had an experience in human history where people are denying that there's a pandemic and protesting a pandemic and putting their lives at risk. And like there's something just so like I think it's like one thing to like carry out like the same like biases and actions of before COVID. And like I just think it's something else completely for people to like genuinely not know that they're putting their lives at risk, and for their like lawmakers to not be like elucidating that they're at risk. Like I don't know. I just think there's something like
Yeah.
horrifying about seeing a protest, like something without any protection, and knowing that like that might kill them, and like they have no idea that they're putting their lives at risk. That being said, the actions of those individuals disproportionately affect people of color, and there's something so callous and like honestly evil about like these groups of like white people like joining up knowing that they like might be propagating spread, because like they don't believe that it'll affect them. They believe that it'll affect like the people of color in society. And like, you know, in some ways they're wrong because like they have the same pre-existing conditions, like if they do, but in other ways like they're right. And like white people know that they can walk around society, get easy access to care, and like the reason that white people feel so empowered and like liberated to like walk around is because they genuinely feel like they will not experience the consequences of their actions. And like time and time again we see in this country that like people of color bear the consequence of pollution, of like environmental like desecration, of, and like I just, you know, that just come to a head with the coronavirus in a way that's really scary. And like I think that yeah, it just
Yeah, I think the
reasons.
people need to stop thinking of us of health as something that is like individual or like atomized. So like it's like you are responsible, like
Yeah.
individual. I'm responsive to health. Like if you're unhealthy, it's because you made bad decisions. And think of health as this more integral, structural network where it's connected to like environmental racism. It's connected to gentrification. It's connected to a legacy of colonialism and extractive industries and pollution. Like all of these things you said have biological effects, have ecological effects, have social effects that affect particular populations. And it's never been so obvious now how structural racism has been so obvious, and how health is way more integrated into so many different factors than just like your personal decisions that you made since you were born. And that's something that I hope people can start to recognize, and that we build networks that completely like address these these knots of like pollution and race
Yeah.
or all these other things. And now maybe ending like on a good note, I want us to like highlight what are some examples of effective mutual aid or interesting things that resistance has been doing, that people outside of like the medicine or just ordinary people are doing. And I could start just, I think the immediate amount of people that were making masks instead of buying masks was nice. Like the donating masks was really cool because there's a certain like DIY punk nature behind it of like I'm not going to spend like money on like a fashion mask if something I could do, and as long as they're sharing that and not like privatizing that, it's fine. I mean, of course at the other end, like fashion designers have done their own masks and they will probably profit from these side of mask making. But more specifically, there were so many networks of mutual aid that were built in so many cities. Like in March, I was invited to three or four different groups of cities that I used to live in that are kind of like doing their own networking and creating networks of support with food, medicine, accountability, and care. Something that my housemates and I have been doing, just like reaching out to our neighbors and letting us know what kind of resources we have and in which ways we can help, and if any, and just kind of like being good neighbors and trying to do the best to like check in on each other. So I do think that in moments of crisis, people will take matters into their own hand and build networks that they see lacking. And I hope that those networks keep alive and well even after the pandemic ends, because that's what I put my money into. Like my energy is into building this alternative system of governance on
Yeah.
top of a government that has failed so many people for so many years.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that has really come to light, and like we touched upon this before, which is kind of the divide between like the hero and like the kind of like drain of resources. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that one of the things that is coming out of this is like a lot of disability organizations like really keeping track of folks in different areas of immune compromised conditions. So like in my mutual aid network, we sent a form and we asked like if anyone had immune compromised conditions. Project Let's is another national nonprofit that does this. And like, I think that because disabled lives are so fundamentally devalued in our country, like people genuinely, like there's this fear, it's like, oh, someone's gonna lie and say they're disabled and like take all the N95s and like, like they're gonna kill the doctors, and like that is just like not the case. And so like by keeping track of like people's medical conditions outside of like a medical industrial complex, like taking it away from the doctor's charts and like kind of like liberating that information if like people are giving their consent, it allows us to just like send resources. So what Project Let's will do is they'll just send N95s to people that say they have immune conditions, because like people don't request these supplies because they're told by society and by our state that they're like liabilities, that they're a drain on resources. So I think something really amazing is establishing like a medical network outside of hospitals in which like individuals can like seek supplies and cares in a way that like you know retains their locus of control, comes from a disability just a standpoint. So that was something really nice that I saw. Another really great thing about mutual aid is like really trying to get to know your communities. And like I think flyering, it can be so powerful, especially for folks that are like housing insecure, like really like basic information on like a phone number to call or like a shelter to go to or like a food bank that's like nearby the flyer. Another great thing that's been happening is like intentional drop-offs for housing insecure folks, so like dropping off packets of like masks, soap, stuff like that. And like I really hope that like those connections that people make by like, and like even me, like during this pandemic, like I before this pandemic, I just feel like I was like very insular as a medical student. And like, I think I did as much as I could to break from that. But like, there's only so much you can do when like you're being like held to this like standard that we can, you know, different conversation. But like, I've definitely made better friends with like the housing insecure folks in the area, or like folks that are doing like partial like recovery programs. And I think that like by virtue of me having like being around my house more and just like being on my block more and just like seeing the same folks like coming to go, I think it's like strengthened my community connections. And like I'd really implore folks to just like really like get comfortable being in your neighborhood. I think people need to accept that they're probably not going to go on a vacation for the next year or two, and like really really devote yourself to like healing the area immediately around you. And like I think that that's something really beautiful from COVID, that I genuinely think if we keep these networks alive, like they're not going to, you know, go away. So that's something like that's like definitely a positive thing. And then yeah, like the DIY mask stuff, I love that stuff. And like a lot of my work that I did in the beginning was like really trying to be like, we really do not need to start like an economy of desperation. Like we really don't, like we have everything we need at home. And like I think that there's something so like I think that there's something empowering about knowing that you have the adequate equipment in your house to protect yourself, and like you don't need all of these like fancy like startup gadgets to like protect yourself. Like humans have dealt with viruses for a very long time. Like you cover your mouth and you stay clean. And I think it's telling that like these very basic principles are the things that are actually going to save us. Yeah, I think that something else about mutual aid. Yeah, I mean, I just think that it's just connecting people in a way that like was just like radically not possible. And I think that like capitalism took our time to do that. Like we were not allowed to have time to do this mutual aid work because capitalism stripped us of that time, like gave us jobs that were so like time consuming and like deadening that like we came home and like all we could do is self-care, right? Like every single day you go to work, you're exhausted, and like you go home, like you try to make yourself dinner and like you self-care for like the 2 hours before like you go to bed and do it all over again. Now that so many people are unemployed, they have the time to like actually extend resources to other people. And like I think the structures that we make during this time are going to last if like we continue to put energy into them. But I think the things that were built now are like, you know, hopefully like built for good.
Yeah,
So
and it's a matter of like life and death. Like it's not like a an abstract kind of like entity there. It's like actual concrete thing that affects so many people. And the stronger our network, the better care we can take of each other and others. And as somebody that doesn't have insurance in a country this is where literally an accident or something can completely ruin your life and get you into so much debt, and how you're kind of socialized to not, in like rad circles, like not to want to trust an institution that's meant to take care of you is completely disheartening and extremely frustrating. So the stronger the network at your community level, at your friend level, at your family level, the more you can protect yourself and protect others with it. So I think let's hope that people learn from all the mistakes that the state has done and that other people have done to like really build something that lasts and that could give the example. And eventually, I mean, exactly how the state did with like the Black Panther like food pantry and like food distribution programs, they will probably steal the ideas of mutual aid that we came up with and claim it as their own. But that's
yeah,
another conversation to have. But I just wanted to know if you have anything last, um, to add to everything that we've been talking about.
I guess like if there's like last piece of advice is just like if you feel like your gut is telling you to do something, like wear a mask or something that a government like health official is saying seems fishy, like I would just obviously like, you know, consult with your friends. But like I think that one of the most tragic thing that happened during this entire pandemic is that our government failed in like recommending mask use, even when everyone on a gut level knew that they should wear masks. And I guess like being like brave and like seeking out like information and like acting in ways that are like deviant is like how we're going to be able to get out of this crisis, and just like trust that like, you know, like if you're like if something, and that's hard because okay, so you were talking about how like people like don't believe in like science, and so it's so tricky to be like have a healthy skepticism of authority but then also listen to their health recommendations. And I feel like the way that I've been able to navigate that is like frankly because of like the excellent education I've been like extended through like my respective privileges. And I think that that's something that people like do not have access to, and like the science education in our country makes it such that like you just believe whatever political figure you like, and like scientific truths are like not subjective. And like I guess that like overall I think this is really demonstrating like a crisis of like scientific communication and like knowledge in our country. And I know that that hasn't been like talked about as much, and like maybe isn't like
Yeah,
as much like a
science literacy. Yeah.
yeah. And you know I think that like health literacy um really like, you know, people in Europe like have better health literacy because like they invest in that, and that was why people were able to act. And like I think there's something very telling on like how like European countries like adhere to like quarantine without like the totalitarian methods that were utilized in like other countries, but also you know, without like the kind of like finding social control methods that we're using in the US, because like there is a high health literacy, and they're like, okay, virus goes in throat, like if I cough it'll like make it go out fast. And I think that like that kind of like common sense science information has been deprived of our population, and like that's another form of social control. So I think just like education is so important. And like if you have the privilege of like knowing kind of these basic science facts, like asking your community like can I do a teach-in, like could I like educate like some of the kids that like are, you know, like home all the time, like what can I do to just like make sure that folks have like good information. And I think like mutual aid and like flyering and like doing work in the community is like a good way of like going about that.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much again for your time and for your wonderful insights. I think I definitely learned a lot, and um, I think we had a pretty rad conversation and we covered so much. And I just wanted to thank you again for your time and for everything. And we'll be definitely inviting you for any next time that we do a conversation like this. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your night.
Take care.
Bye.